So I thought since we were doing a session on magic and medications not being magic, we'd start with a magic trick. Now for this trick, I only need 20 cards, so just give me a second to count those out. So people have been doing magic tricks really for centuries. Yeah. The first recorded magic trick was performed in Greece in 2600 BC. I guess you could call that the oldest trick in the book. But really since then, people have been using them to wow and impress at parties and any variety of other places since then. This is a pretty simple magic trick. I'm going to guess what your card is. Cool. But first, I need you to give me a number between, let's say, 7 and 17.
11.
11. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. All right. This is your card. You can look at it. You can show it to the audience. I'm not going to peek. All right. Now I'll tell you what your card was. So it's a black card, and it's higher than a 7. It is not a club. It's a spade. Give the king of spades. All right.
Quite convenient that we're a crown, isn't it?
So I feel pretty lucky that trick went according to plan. I'm just going to grab the presenter from you. Excellent. So I just performed a magic trick. And like my simple card trick, the response to adrenaline and anaphylaxis seems like magic. People can go from near death from a severe allergic reaction to clinically well, sometimes even in minutes. It really is remarkable. People have been using this trick to wow and impress patients and care providers for about a century since it came into practice. But like my simple card trick, the magic of adrenaline doesn't have anything to do with the supernatural. It actually only works through a set of well-coordinated actions that are thoughtfully planned and confidently delivered. If you ask me to reveal my card trick today, I'll refuse. I actually need that in my back pocket for a later date. But today, with you, I'm more than happy to explore the magic of adrenaline and anaphylaxis, because when we get that trick wrong, people die. All of this requires a bit of an understanding of what anaphylaxis is and how adrenaline comes into play. So, a brief review: anaphylaxis is a severe, life-threatening allergy that usually comes on really suddenly, often includes 2 or more organ systems, and it's very common, actually. In Australia, between 3 and 5 out of every 100 school-age kids are at risk for developing anaphylaxis. Unfortunately, the rates of anaphylaxis are on the rise, and in Australia in particular, the rates of fatal anaphylaxis are also increasing. When kids die from anaphylaxis, it tends to be from a food allergy or from a venom allergy. So when people who are at risk for anaphylaxis get exposed to an allergen, there's a whole bunch of things that happen, the most important of which is mast cells basically exploding and releasing histamine, which is responsible for most of what we see in anaphylaxis. It's responsible for the tachycardia, the bronchorrhea, the bronchospasm, the hypotension, the urticaria, and the GI symptoms. Kids tend to get urticaria and respiratory symptoms, but in really little kids, sometimes the GI symptoms are actually what predominate. When kids die from anaphylaxis, they tend to die from hypoxia that's related to the bronchoconstriction and sometimes to the angioedema. Adrenaline is a magic bullet drug. It halts the progression to fatal anaphylaxis, and when given early, it saves lives. Seems pretty simple, right? In fact, I'm not actually going to talk about any of the other medications that we use in the treatment of anaphylaxis today because their importance pales in comparison to adrenaline. It is the only frontline medication that we use. Seems like magic. But like any good magic trick, the reality is much more complicated. We can explore the smoke and mirrors of adrenaline and anaphylaxis by asking some simple questions of our patients and of ourselves. Early into my first year as an emergency medicine resident, I was leaving the hospital after a shift. About 500 meters from our department doors, I responded as a bystander to a young woman who seemed to be in a fair bit of distress. Even to a really fresh emergency medicine resident, the diagnosis of anaphylaxis was not in question at all. In fact, I had seen this before in simulation. I knew what she needed, I knew how the disease was going to progress, and I knew that what she needed was something I had regarded as always fairly magic. I knew that she needed adrenaline. So I did what any self-respecting emergency medicine resident, or probably really any bystander in this situation would do. I tried to get her some. I called 911, I emptied her backpack in search of an auto-injector, ominously finding Ventolin instead. I called out to a doctor that I recognized across the street, asked him to run back into the hospital to see if he could get help. I called out to some bystanders, and at one point I just wished that I could give her some of the adrenaline that was running through my own veins. Now, after I had exhausted all of these options, I sat with her and I held her hand and I waited. My early simulation training allowed me to respond with some degree of external control to what I recognized to be a spiraling scenario. But it did not prepare me for the helplessness that I felt as her two-word sentences that were punctuated by wheeze progressed to one-word utterances and then to the unwanted silence of unconsciousness while we waited for adrenaline to arrive. Just as the ambulances came and help from inside the hospital arrived, Andrea lost her pulse. And though about 8 minutes later we obtained ROSC, or we got her pulse back, if that is what you call it in Australia, ROSC, she was nearly impossible to ventilate because of her concomitant asthma. She suffered a severe hypoxic brain injury, and unfortunately 2 days later, she was removed from life support surrounded by her loving family. Now, that day, Andrea's family lost their loving, sweet, funny 18-year-old daughter. She had just started university 2 days prior, and she was hoping to be a psychologist. And I share this story with you today with the endorsement and the permission of her family because they hope that others don't suffer this same loss. Now, in a completely different stratosphere to what Andrea's family went through on that day. Early in my medical career, I came to a realization as well. I came to a realization that medications aren't magic. That even when we have that perfect treatment, sometimes it's just not enough. Everybody in this room here today knows how people die of anaphylaxis. But since that experience, I have been trying to grapple with the much more complicated question of why. Why, when we have a perfect treatment, are young people still dying of this disease? And we can look to a little bit of work that's done in the cardiac sciences to help us with this complicated question. Some of you might recognize this as the chain of survival for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Since focusing on each of the links in this chain, some communities have doubled their rate of survival from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And even though the principles aren't exactly the same, I think we can borrow this model to think about the chain of survival in anaphylaxis. And we can do this by asking some simple questions. As we go through this, I want you to think about what is your weakest link? What is your patient's weakest link? There's a whole group of people who are at risk of anaphylaxis that are very easy to identify. Those are patients who have had anaphylaxis before. And those patients are going to leave your office or leave your emergency department with an adrenaline autoinjector. But there's a whole other group of people who are at risk of dying from their first ever episode of anaphylaxis. And these are people who are like the one that I told you in the story. People who have asthma, particularly if it's severe and uncontrolled, and who have food allergy. Even if they've never had anaphylaxis before, they are at risk of dying from a first episode of anaphylaxis. The guidelines about who should be prescribed adrenaline autoinjectors in advance of ever having anaphylaxis vary a bit from region to region. So I would encourage you to go back to where you're from and take a look at the allergy guidelines. But most of them include this group of kids with asthma and food allergy. Those patients should see an allergist and be followed up for their long-term risk. We are really bad at recognizing anaphylaxis. Both lay people and physicians and other healthcare providers aren't good at recognizing anaphylaxis. For patients and their parents, this means regular counseling about what anaphylaxis looks like and what symptoms to look for. Anybody in this room can provide some counseling around this. As healthcare providers, we need to be comfortable with the diagnosis, which is easy to say, but there's a couple of times when this should be climbing up your differential when things aren't going right. It's in patients who have unexplained hypotension and in patients who are treating for severe asthma, but it's just not responding the way that we want it to. I know this was covered in an earlier session today. Those patients we should be considering treating with adrenaline. Next, we need to think about whether there's access to adrenaline, and this is a critical link in the chain of survival, and it's probably the one that we have the biggest issue with. Now, I could spend an hour talking about access to adrenaline, but instead I'm just going to highlight a few key points that show that this is a much more complicated issue than just telling our patients to carry their EpiPens. There's critical shortages to adrenaline in many parts of the world. In Canada, there's critical shortages that are expected to last well into the fall. In some jurisdictions, the cost of adrenaline autoinjectors is prohibitive, sometimes costing several hundreds of dollars. While we're fighting the big fight against governments and pharmaceutical companies, we should be connecting our patients with social workers to help and see if we might be able to mitigate some of these costs. Next, about 50% of patients with food allergy experience bullying related to their food allergy. This is particularly important in our teenage populations. The bullying that they face at school and in their peer groups may prevent them from carrying autoinjectors. And along those lines, we might work with pharmaceutical companies to design better, more patient-centered delivery devices that are easier to carry. There's smart policies that we can implement in our communities and in our schools that might increase access. Exploring access to adrenaline for our patients is critical. Now, finally, if we've made it this far down the chain of survival, we just have to give the adrenaline. There's no contraindication to its use in anaphylaxis. I'll say that one more time. There is no contraindication to the use of adrenaline in anaphylaxis. There are, however, cognitive barriers to the use of adrenaline in anaphylaxis, and those are very real for patients and for care providers. With our patients, we could consider doing some more regular, either actual simulations or mental rehearsals of how they're going to give adrenaline. And for care providers, we just need to get comfortable with this. And that's where key interventions that make giving high-stress medications in high-stress situations a little bit easier. So things like the Monash book are perfect. This medication makes us uncomfortable for a number of reasons. First, it's given through a route that we're uncomfortable with. We don't give a lot of IM medications. There are multiple doses and concentrations of adrenaline that float around our resuscitation room. There's lots of ways for this to go wrong, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be giving it. For some people in the audience, the right choice may be an adrenaline autoinjector in your clinic or your urgent care, particularly if you're not using this often, and that is fine too. So there we have it, the chain of survival in anaphylaxis. What is your weakest link? While we're busy here sitting and thinking about recognizing and diagnosing and treating anaphylaxis, patients like Andrea's family and researchers at some centers are dreaming a lot bigger. They're thinking about ways that we can actually eliminate anaphylaxis as a problem altogether. Is there a way that we can get rid of this as a problem as a society? That's it. That's the magic of adrenaline in anaphylaxis. By asking simple questions of our patients and of ourselves, we might not be able to practice the oldest, but certainly one of the most important tricks in the book. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Eve. Are there any questions from here, down in the room? Beck.
We've rolled out AEDs in shopping centres and sports centres and everywhere. Should there have an EpiPen next to every one of those?
Yeah, so that's a really frequent question. There's a number of issues that make EpiPens obviously a little bit different than defibrillators, mostly that they expire. We need to continue to empower our patients to carry a medication that's important for them. But I think that in specific high-risk areas, having adrenaline auto-injectors available makes sense. So particularly in sports facilities, we know that exercise and anaphylaxis often come hand in hand. Certainly in schools and universities and cafeterias, that makes sense as well. So on the campus that Andrea died on, the security guards now carry adrenaline auto-injectors. I think that it's worth thinking about within our communities. It's certainly not a substitute, but I think the more adrenaline around, probably the better. Yeah. Yes.
What's the thinking around patients with anaphylaxis or they've required adrenaline, giving them doses of steroids, prednisolone, and then the next day as well? I encountered a situation in general practice where a patient comes in with, I ingested something, not typical symptoms for anaphylaxis, but so I guess I've got two questions there. The second question is with ingested allergens, is there a safety period we can tell patients, look, it's been 4 to 6 hours since the exposure, it's unlikely to be anaphylaxis, but go home and keep an eye on it, or can we just reassure them after a certain time period? Do you have any thinking around that? I know that ingested allergens can present much later than your other parental exposures.
Yeah, so there certainly is a risk, mostly of a secondary reaction. And that's what steroids are kind of designed to try to prevent. Whether they do that or not is a bit up in the air. Most of the patients in our department would get that. I think probably a critical jump off from that question is there patients who are treated with adrenaline early on that can be discharged early? Because a big barrier to parents giving adrenaline is knowing that they're going to have to wait in our department for 6 hours when their child is fine. We're certainly not there yet, but our kind of common practice in emergency medicine would be observation for about 4 to 6 hours. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yes,
You know, some kids have dermatographism and some don't. Does that predict their risk of having of recurrence?
Of which, sorry?
Dermatographism. Like in some kids, you draw X's and it'll come up in a well. Especially if this comes on during exercise, as opposed to the other kinds. I just wondered if that would predict the risk of them recurring, or whether we should be more willing to give them epi or.
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure.
Dermographism is more it's a sign of urticaria, and urticaria and anaphylaxis are not the same, and risk stratification is not related.
So don't.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks very much. I want to thank all our speakers. I think it was a terrific afternoon, and I'm going to leave you with some words from Harry Potter, given that we were talking about magic. This is from Albus Dumbledore in the last book. Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and of remedying it. I'll leave you to use your words carefully.